So in the third talk this morning, I'm going to discuss how you can build muscle in horses, because we know that very athletic horses have a lot of muscle, and being well muscled is important for performance, especially in sports such as trotting. Next slide, please. So the question is, how do you build muscle in a horse? Next slide, please. Well, the first principle is that you cannot build muscle without exercise. So even if you give a horse anabolic steroids, if you do not exercise the horse will not develop more muscle. So the horse has to be doing the right amount of exercise and frequently enough to build muscle. Next slide, please. So the exercise must be often enough. If the horse is only exercising 3 days a week, this probably will not be enough to build muscle. So if the horse is exercising at least 5 days a week, then this should be sufficient to build muscle. Next slide, please. A horse that is exercising at maybe just walk or slow trotting is not going to develop much muscle. The horse has to be exercising hard enough for the muscles to be stimulated to grow. Next slide, please. You cannot build muscle without the right nutrition, so it's important that the horse has sufficient energy and sufficient protein in order to be able to build muscle. And we're going to now talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So another requirement for the horse to be able to build muscle is that it must be getting more energy in from its food than it is using up, and we call this a positive energy balance. Next slide, please. The horse also requires a good source of protein. So if the horse is not getting enough protein, or the protein is not of good enough quality, then this can limit the development of muscle. Next slide, please. And of course, with horses, we have plenty of different sources of quality protein. So oats, linseed, grass, things like peas, soya, etc., alfalfa, all of these are very good sources of protein. And the harder, next slide please, the harder a horse works, the more protein it needs. Next slide, please. One amino acid that is very important for building protein is the amino acid lysine. So often we refer to protein quality by the lysine content. This is the amount of lysine in a protein, which lysine is a single amino acid. This is an indicator of the quality of the protein. So horses must be getting enough lysine in order for them to grow new muscle. Next slide, please. So the amount of lysine a horse in hard work would need is around 9 grams per day. And that would come from around 1.3 kilograms of crude protein. Next slide, please. However, many people believe that if you feed a lot more lysine, then you will get a much better effect. This is simply not true. Once you have reached the horse's minimum need for lysine, feeding extra will not have any effect. And that is actually, it's a waste of time. And if you are feeding a lot of protein, too much protein, this can cause problems, because if the horse eats a lot of protein, then this means that it has to break that protein that it doesn't need down, and that requires the horse to drink more, and we get more urea in the urine, and we get more ammonia in the stable when urea is broken down by bacteria in the bedding to ammonia. So feeding a lot of lysine above the minimum amount required is not going to build muscle. Next slide, please. So what about muscle building supplements? Well, we've already talked about high lysine, but there are others. Next slide, please. So high lysine is not effective. Next slide, please. What about creatine? Because creatine does work in human athletes and has been proved to improve performance in many different studies. So does creatine work in horses? Next slide, please. Well, if we look, there are hundreds and hundreds of creatine supplements for horses. So maybe they are good. Next slide, please. But actually, there is a problem with creatine in horses. Horses do not eat meat. They are herbivores. Creatine is very high in meat. Now, what we know from a number of studies is that horses are unable to absorb creatine. This shouldn't be a surprise, because why would they have evolved to absorb something from that they don't ever eat? So it makes sense that they cannot absorb creatine. And actually, there are some studies which have fed creatine to horses and shown there is absolutely no effect whatsoever on performance or muscle growth or anything. So creatine supplements are a waste of time and money in horses, and I would strongly advise not to feed them. Next slide, please. Here are just 3 of the scientific studies of creatine in horses which show that creatine does not work. Next slide, please. The next muscle building supplement I want to talk about is gamma oryzanol. This has been marketed for a long time as a natural steroid, and it comes from rice bran or rice bran oil. It was for a short time banned by the FEI in eventing and dressage and show jumping, but then the ban was reversed. And there are not many studies, but 2 studies in human subjects did not find any effect of feeding gamma oryzanol on muscle. And 1 study in horses found that feeding 2 grams, which is quite a high amount, for 31 days did not change muscle or blood testosterone levels. And in fact, some studies have even suggested that gamma oryzanol may reduce testosterone, which is certainly not something you want to do in a racehorse, in a trotter. And so we have no studies that have shown any evidence that gamma oryzanol has any effect on muscle growth or muscle in any way whatsoever. So there is no point to feeding gamma oryzanol. This is again a waste of money. Next slide, please. One of the supplements that has become used a lot in the last perhaps few years is something called spirulina. And spirulina is a blue-green algae, and when you see it on the beach, it looks like this on the left. If you look at it under the magnifying glass, it looks like in the middle, and then if you dry it and grind it up, it looks like this on the right. Next slide, please. So it does have a lot of protein in it, but horses won't eat a high amount. So even if it was 100% protein, if you're only able to give the horse 10 grams, that is still a very low amount of protein. It doesn't taste very nice either, so this is another problem. It's suggested to be a good source of B vitamins, which is debatable. And it's also high in iron. Now, iron is not a very effective energy booster, and in fact, it's very unusual for horses to be deficient in iron, and feeding high iron diets causes more problems, and actually it doesn't treat anemia, it doesn't give them extra energy. it interferes with things such as copper and zinc and can lead to poor performance and even liver damage. So spirulina isn't really the best thing to feed. It can also often contains high levels of toxic metals, harmful bacteria, and microorganisms called microcystins, which can make you very ill. In people, when people have eaten contaminated blue-green algae, they experience liver damage, stomach pain, vomiting, and in some cases it has led to people being seriously ill or even dying. Next slide, please. So the protein that is in spirulina is really no different to the protein that we see in other feed ingredients that we use a lot, such as oats, soya, or linseed. It's not a magic protein. It's not a different protein. Next slide, please. And in fact, this is a quote from the US National Library of Medicine, where they say, "You may have been told that blue-green algae are an excellent source of protein, but in reality, blue-green algae is no better than meat or milk as a protein source and costs about 30 times as much per gram." So it's concentrated, yes, but it carries a lot of risks and it's expensive. Next slide, please. And actually, it doesn't really do anything special. In fact, there is a product produced by Boehringer, the drug company, which is called Equitop Myoplast. And what you can see in this graph are all the different amino acids that you get in feeding, for example, 68 grams of oats, or 63 grams of linseed, or 20 grams of spirulina, or 50 grams of Equitop Myoplast. They would all deliver the same amount of protein and the same amino acids, but none of them at that amount will have any effect on building muscle. So I certainly wouldn't waste your money on, I wouldn't use spirulina or Equitop Myoplast. These cannot work as muscle builders. Next slide, please. So these are things that we commonly find that people are told that will build muscle, or they are sold in supplements to build muscle for horses, but none of these will work. Next slide, please. So if none of those work, what can you use? Well, one of the amino acids called leucine and its metabolite HMB have actually been shown to have quite significant effects on muscle. They have been shown to stimulate new muscle growth, help recovery from exercise, help restore glycogen, delay the onset of fatigue, and maintain mental function. But this is when leucine is fed just on its own or with HMB and at a very high amount. Next slide, please. So what can you use to build muscle? Well, remember, we have said your horse must be in regular work. Your horse must be working hard enough. Your horse must be getting sufficient protein. Your horse must be getting sufficient lysine. And your horse must be getting more energy in than it's using up each day. Now, if you are doing all of those things, next slide, please, and you add in either leucine and or HMB, then there is some evidence that these will have an effect on a beneficial effect in terms of muscle building, but also on other things. For example, some studies in horses have shown improved endurance, increased red blood cell number, and actually increase in performance as well. Next slide, please. So what you can use is a high dose of leucine and a high dose of HMB, along with a source of complex carbohydrate, and given within 30 minutes of finishing hard training. And this would have a beneficial effect. Next slide, please. So, what can you feed to build muscle? High lysine, creatine, gamma oryzanol, spirulina, equitop myoplast will not build muscle. If your horse is in regular work and that work is hard enough and you are feeding sufficient protein and sufficient but not excess lysine, and your horse is getting more energy in than he's using, and you feed 20 to 30 grams of leucine, and 15 grams of HMB, then yes, that could have a positive effect on energy balance and muscle development. Thank you.